As I mentioned earlier, we're living in times that are very uncertain and unsettling, aren't they? As you turn the news on, there are things every day that seem to trouble us, whether it's the wars and the bombs, whether it's the fire and the flames in the Middle East or Ukraine, or whether it's the corruption and the darkness of the rich and the famous. Whatever we might see on the news can unsettle us. And so how are we to view that? How are we to view the news? How are we to watch things that are happening? And not only that, it's not just on the news screens, is it? Maybe it's in your life you're facing uncertainty. Maybe you've heard news that has just devastated you. Maybe you see loved ones suffering and you just don't know where to turn. As a Christian this morning, how are you to view those things that hit us out of the blue? If you're not a Christian here this morning, maybe you know what it's like to turn on the news or to see things in your life and just to worry about things and to think, how is this going to turn out? Where do we turn? And maybe you're waking up in the night sleepless and just you can't get back because your mind is racing, your heart is beating fast because you're just worried about what's going on. Well, the book of Revelation that we are coming to this morning is speaking into a really tough situation, as I mentioned earlier. These Christians are facing huge uncertainty. They're facing a huge threat from the powers around them. And spiritually, the church, in the chapters before 4 and 5, we see the church is in a mess as well, spiritually. So they're facing persecution. They look around them in the church and they're a shambles. And they're wondering, is there really any point in going on? The temptation for them was to give up. The temptation would have been to asking, is Jesus really worth it? Is this really true what I'm living for? Because if it's not, as they see another of their friends dragged away and thrown to the lions, as they see another member of their family maybe dipped in tar and set alight to entertain Nero in his parties, they're thinking, is he worth it? Is Jesus worth it? Is this worth going on? Well, as they come to read from John as he wrote this letter to them, what we find and what they found in this book was something that would help them to keep going through the toughest of times. And we know from church history that this church grew and grew and turned the world upside down. So what is there in this book that can help us to keep going? By giving that introduction, I'm hoping that'll protect us from some of the ways we can misuse Revelation. So sometimes Revelation is used as to kind of crack a secret code or to say when this is going to happen or that's going to happen. Remember, first and foremost, this was written to first century Christians who were thinking of giving up. That should kind of filter out any zany, crazy explanations we might find in there. What difference would it have made to them then? And then we can see, wow, this can really help me today. So, what is written in Revelation to help them keep going, and what is written to help you to keep going, to give you peace in uncertain times? Well, there are three truths from these two chapters I want us to think on together. And as I mentioned, there's a lot in these chapters. We're not going to be able to cover every single detail. But I pray as we look at the big picture of it, it will give us real help in our lives. The first thing we see, and the first thing in chapter 4 we see this, that we need to grasp and that we need to remember as we watch the news, as we see things happening in our lives, is there is a throne. There is a throne. So the book of Revelation, that word means revealing, unveiling. And here we get glimpses into truths, into realities that there is the truth about here and now. Behind the scenes, as it were, of heaven. And if you'd like to watch behind the scenes things about your favourite films or TV programmes, how do they make this? How do they do that? Well, this is the behind the scenes of heaven. What's going on right now? Because we see in verse 1 of chapter 4, you see, John is looking there and he says, behold, a door standing open in heaven. It's as if he's just given it, the door's left open, and I can just glimpse in to see what is going on. And as he glimpses in, what is revealed to him is something so wonderful and glorious that he finds it hard to put into words. Look at what he sees in verse 2. He says, I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven. So he looked through this door that was slightly open, and he saw the throne of heaven. Now, this is the throne that is above every throne. And throughout Revelation, if you want to understand Revelation, you need to see so many times it's referring back to the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is the key to unlock it. And here we see references to Ezekiel 1, there's a throne there. Isaiah 6, there's a throne we see there. And we see that the thrones mentioned there is the throne of heaven that is above every other throne and rule and authority. And notice there what we're told about this in verse 2. There was a throne in heaven and one seated on the throne. Now, I want us to pause there for a moment. There was somebody seated on the throne. Now, that should bring us just real comfort. The throne of heaven this morning is occupied. The throne, the one who sits there, who rules over all nations, over all rulers, there is someone seated on the throne. God, is still in control. The throne of heaven is occupied. There's somebody above the rulers that we see in this world who is still in control. Whatever we see around us. Think of the comfort that would have been in the first century to these Christians hearing. The throne of heaven isn't empty. There isn't just nobody there and we're left to our own devices. But God there sits, as it were, on the throne, and he rules and he reigns. I hope that's a comfort this morning. Maybe there's a situation in your life and you think, what is going on? We might not have all the answers, but as we get the glimpse into heaven, we start there and think, wow, the throne is occupied. But he goes on as he tries to describe this picture. And there's so much to see. He tries to describe it and he can't get the words across. Do you see what he sees there in verse 3? He who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. And round the throne is this rainbow that had the appearance of emerald. And then these 24 elders, he sees these creatures. There's this lightning. It's just this glorious scene that he's trying to get across to us in language that he finds it hard to describe. So he tells, look, the throne had the appearance of jasper or carnelian. That is, it's just bright. It's glorious. Almost has to turn away because of the brightness of it, you can imagine. And he tells us in verse 5, there's flashes of lightning, rumblings of and peals of thunder. So this is just a massive scene. If you've ever been caught in a storm or seen the devastation of a storm, you can just picture, can't you, just how small you feel in the kind of light of its power and strength. And we can be scared just by the power of a storm can have. Well, here, around the thrones, there's just this peal of thunder, this noise, this light, this brightness. It's glorious. It's beautiful. It's so other. It's holy. And this throne is wonderful. Not only that, but look down to verse 6. What we're told is before the throne. Before the throne, there was, as it were, a sea of glass. Now, as you read through Revelation, you need to notice that what's been described isn't necessarily what is there, but it's telling us something, teaching us something. So when you see creatures with loads of eyes, it's not describing a lamb that has got loads of eyes, but it's saying these eyes are everywhere, as in the lamb sees everything. He sees all that goes on, and we'll look at that in a moment. But what is a glassy sea? What's that about? Well, in the book of Revelation, as you read on, you'll see that threatening things end up coming from the sea. And throughout the Old Testament, the sea is a place of chaos and mystery and darkness. But here we see, what is this sea now? It's like glass before God. He's in total control of what seems like chaos. Total control of what seems threatening and scary. And that is comforting. Because in this life, we face things that seem chaotic, that seem threatening, that seem too scary for us to comprehend. When we remember God is on his throne, he is working out his purposes, and he's in control of what seems like chaos. It is under his feet, and it's like glass before him. There's one who sees the end from the beginning, one who is working out all of his promises. One pastor put it like this. He used the illustration of a chessboard. I don't play chess, but if you do, you'll know this. A chessboard has 204 squares. So it has 16 pieces and 7 different actions that those pieces can do. And do you know how many variations you could have within a chess game? Just a small board with that many squares, that can do that, that can do that. There are apparently 48 million variations of different moves and things that can happen, just in a small chessboard. Now, when you enlarge that to this world, and you think of how many pieces there are on this kind of chessboard of life, if you like, well, there are trillions and billions and you just can't grasp, can you, how many things, because that happened. But we've got a God who sees it all, knows it all, and in what seems like chaos, he knows just what move is going to happen next. The glassy sea he rules and reigns over. And we see that because in verse 8 we describe these 4 living creatures. They sound strange. They've got 6 wings and they're full of eyes around and within. And the idea is that these creatures, who are God's creatures, can see all that is happening. It tells us that God, nothing goes from out of his sight. He sees everything at once, all times. He sees it all of time in one view. He sees everything that happens, both outwardly and obvious, but behind closed doors as well. Now, can you think of how that would have helped a first century Christian who had just seen somebody in their family taken away and killed? Many people might not have noticed, but God sees it, and he cares about what's going on. As you think through those truths, perhaps you're going through something and nobody else knows. People might know small details, but they don't know what you're really going through. They don't know what you're really struggling with. Well, God has seen it, and he knows. The one on the throne, the one who rules above all, knows about your situation, and not just sees it, but he cares about you, and he cares about your situation. Maybe you're aware of injustice in the world, and it seems like people just seem to be getting away with things. Maybe you've faced injustice in your life, and maybe that person has never brought to justice. And you think things just seem unfair. There's a God here who has seen, and who one day will put all things right. Nothing escapes his view. Now that is challenging and encouraging, isn't it? Because God sees all the failure that I do, all of my mess in my life, as well as the mess in other people's life. And that's why we need to come to God again and say, God, I'm sorry. You know what I've done. Will you forgive me? Is that what God can do? Well, one of the other things around the throne shows us and reminds us God's heart. The one on this throne is, yes, powerful and glorious, but also he's merciful. Do you notice that we're told that there's a rainbow around the throne in verse 3? A rainbow had this appearance around the throne. Why a rainbow? Well, again, Genesis, the Old Testament helps us. The rainbow was God's permanent reminder given to Noah of his mercy and his covenant. He says, I won't destroy the world again like that. And even though the world will rebel against me, I won't flood it again. Spurgeon points out something lovely about the rainbow. He says, Spurgeon was a 19th century preacher from London. And he says, God hung his bow in the air. So what is a bow? Well, think of a bow and arrow. If a bow is pointing at you, kind of downwards, that's quite a threat, isn't it? Because you're being aimed at. So apparently in the Near East, if they saw stars in the shape of a bow, they'd think the gods are angry with us because the arrow is heading towards us. What did God do with his bow? Well, he hung it in the sky. And where's it facing? It's facing upwards, isn't it? And the bow isn't, and the arrow isn't facing at us anymore in the judgment we deserve, but the arrow is facing heaven. And when you think of how that points us to the mercy of God, Jesus, the one in heaven that we'll look at in a moment, the Lamb who was slain, took the arrow of justice for us, didn't he, on the cross? So around the throne you have this reminder of the bow and the arrow is pointing upwards because Jesus took your judgment instead of us taking it. So the one on the throne loves us and is forgiving and kind and merciful, and he knows and he sees all. So can you see, when we grasp that this throne is occupied, that someone rules and reigns, when we see that this is somebody who is merciful and loving and kind, somebody who controls the chaos, even though to us it looks like a mess, there is comfort here because we need to realize, as chapter 4 shows us, there is a throne. Secondly, we need to see, and we'll see this in chapter 5 now, is there's a plan. There's a plan. Verses 1 to 5 we see this. So we're told there in verse 1, there was, in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne, was a scroll. And this scroll was written on, front and back, so it's complete, it's full. There's no more to add to it or take away. And it is sealed. And it's sealed with 7 seals. 7 in Revelation, you'll see, is a perfect, kind of a complete number. And people would have used a scroll back in the first century. It would have been a legal document, an important document. What is this scroll that he's holding? Well, again, the Old Testament unlocks it for us, because in Daniel 12 and Daniel 7, we see that Daniel gets this vision of what's going to happen in the whole of the universe. This is the plan of the universe. And it is rolled up in a scroll, and it's sealed. So as you read the Revelation 6 and 7, we see these seals are opened. And what happens is, you see, this is the purposes and the plans of God for the universe. This is the world's destiny. This is your destiny in this scroll. And it is held in the hand of the one on the throne. It's God's plan to kind of fix this all. To know that there is an end in sight. You know, when you watch a film, it can get quite tense. If you like watching tense thrillers, intense films, you can get tense in the middle, can't you? Because you're wondering, which way is this going to go? How is this going to end? Is there going to be a happily ever after, or is it going to be dark ending? And you're tense. It feels hard to watch. Well, here, God has got the story, and he says, look, I want to show you the end. This is my plan to sort it all out. But then in verse 4, as we see the scrolls in the hand of the one seated on the throne, verse 4, John begins to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. So why does John burst into tears? Because there was nobody in heaven or on earth who could bring these things to pass. There's the plan, but it's not going to be achieved. Now, it's symbolic language. What is it telling us? Well, at this stage, it's showing us, well, there's no plan then. If nobody can unlock the seals and the plan's stuck, there's no purpose. There's no hope. There's no end of the story. It's just darkness and despair. And his response is, he just breaks down. It leads him to weep uncontrollably because there is no plan here. Now, if you remove God from our lives and from the situation and how we view things, if we remove him from the picture, what are we left with? We're left with John crying in this verse. We're like him. We've just got hopelessness and despair. Totally reliant on somebody else to sort it. Can somebody find an answer to these issues, sort out the problem? And the reality is, if you look at human history, we just keep on messing things up. No one is worthy, and it's a mess. So when we remove God, there's no hope, there's no plan, there's no purpose, there's no goal. It's just darkness. Now, perhaps that's you this morning. You're living your life, and you've removed God totally out of it. And as you look on the world, you're looking at just on kind of what we can see level, and it is terrifying. Because there doesn't seem to be any plan. There doesn't seem to be any hope. And the people who are ruling and the people who are in power just seem corrupt and dark, and you think, what is going on? And maybe you feel like John in verse 4, and you just begin to weep. There's no purpose, it's just dark and it's tough. Now maybe this is why in our life we're so good at distracting ourselves. There's so many things for us not to think about that. So if you remove God from the picture, there's no hope, and so we can't think about that. So we just try and distract ourselves. From the moment we get up, we can distract ourselves from thinking. We've got access to whatever we want on our phones. Just there it is. Whether it's watching something or listening to something or just taking our minds away from something, we just distract ourselves from the reality. Maybe that's what you do. So you don't have to think about the chaos that's around us. We don't have to think about the consequences of there being no God. But wonderfully in Revelation, it doesn't end in verse 4 with John weeping, with nobody able to fulfill God's plan. Verse 5, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so he can open up the scroll and its 7 seals. So here it is. Look, there's no need to weep. There's no need to be in despair, because there is somebody worthy. Who is it? It's the Lion of Judah. Who is that? Well, that's one of Judah, one of the sons of Jacob. From him was promised to be a king. So we're looking out for the king in the Old Testament. Then we see this king's going to be one of David's descendants, King David's descendants. And here he is, the Lion, the king. Jesus is the Lion. He's the king. One powerful enough to make this plan happen. Now let's stand back and see what that's telling us for a moment. This means that Jesus is able to take the scroll and to open the seals and accomplish the plan of the Father. He's able to do it. So we don't have to, that means there is a plan. That means there is hope. The world isn't spiraling out of control, but God is bringing things to his end. And as the scroll is opened, you can read in chapter 6 and 7, we see this plan unfolds. Now, interestingly, in those chapters, it's not then everything's rosy and everything's easy. There's tribulation. There are hard things to come. But through it all, you know there is a plan. And doesn't that make the difference? Again, when you're in the middle of a story, a book or a film that seems dark and hard, if you've seen it already before, I know where this is going. Well, we know the end of the story here. And God says, I'm bringing it to pass. I'm bringing all this to pass. See, knowing there's a plan, knowing it includes struggles and pain, can help us in the midst of it. It keeps us from cynicism. It keeps us from despair. But also it keeps us from hyper kind of optimism, because we know things will be hard. but through it all, God has got me. So John goes from this weeping to joy in a moment because the lion is there. Somebody is worthy to open the scroll. God has got it. So there's reasons to rejoice. Can you see that this morning? There is a throne, but there's also a plan. And we are in the middle of that plan. We're in the middle of the tribulation, maybe, in the middle of the tough times. But it doesn't mean that God isn't working his purposes out. So there is a throne, there's a plan. And the last thing we see is this. There is a Saviour. There is a Saviour. So who is it that can open the scroll? Well, we're told, aren't we? Look what we're told. There is somebody worthy to open the scroll. It is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, and he can open the 7 seals. So here is this animal, a lion, powerful, mighty, strong, kind of a majestic being. But then he looks, and by the lion, he sees somebody, and what does he see? Between the throne, verse 6, and the 4 living creatures, and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing. A lamb that looks like it's been slain. Now, so what's going on here? Remember, this is symbolism. It's pictures of truths for us to grasp. This is a lion who has conquered, but how was he conquered? By becoming a lamb who was slain. Now, the lamb in the Old Testament is full of symbolism. We see it in lots of places. In the Old Testament, we see the lamb of the Passover. You remember that in the story of Exodus? There, God's people were set free, and on the last of the plagues, somebody had to die in each home. It was either the lamb or the firstborn. And so the lamb was the substitute for the firstborn. And then you read Isaiah 53, and it tells us that this promised one would be led like a lamb to the slaughter. So again, this is speaking of Jesus. He's the lamb who was slain. Jesus is the one who's worthy. He's the one who's victorious. And so as you read the description of him, it tells us that he has 7 horns. Now again, this isn't literal. A lamb with 7 horns sounds strange, doesn't it? But the idea of a horn is power. Now that means power. So 7 horns, this is perfect, complete power. He's got 7 eyes. And again, if they're drawing this in Sunday school and they come out showing, look what I've drawn, it's going to be terrifying. But the point isn't, look what it looks like, but what does it mean? Here's Jesus who sees all things that is happening. Perfect seeing, 7 eyes. There's nothing he can't do, and he can bring all things to pass because he sees all things. How? Because he's the lamb that was slain. So at the center of all history, the one who is worthy to open these seals, it all revolves around Jesus. It's all his. Now again, look at verse 9. What's been sung in heaven? Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. You were slain. By your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you've made them kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. Can you see what song is being sung? What is the kind of heart of the song sung in heaven? It's the cross. It's the cross of Jesus. Can you see why that needs to be at the center of our life as a church? It's what's at the center of the songs of heaven. The Lamb that was slain. So why is Jesus' death such good news? Why is this the center of our joy? Well, think of chapter 4. We thought about that throne. This kind of inaccessible, glorious throne which showed us the glory and the greatness of God the Father. This unapproachable light, the lightning and the thunder. How can we approach that? How can we approach him? We can only approach him because Jesus died so that we could get there. Remember in the Garden of Eden, there we were created to know the presence of God, to know his love. But we rebelled against God. And so God said, look, you can't be in my presence now. I'm a consuming fire. If you come near me in your presence and your sin, you'll die. And so what was made to protect the garden, to protect that? We have this flaming sword of fire. What's it saying? To get back into God's presence, you have to go through the sword. Blood has to be shed. And so what did Jesus do for us? To get back into the presence, he took the sword for us. He took that and he shed his blood so we now have access to the presence of God. We can be forgiven and we can know the life we were created for, living in the presence of God before his face all the time. So Jesus' death and resurrection show us, wow, that's what it's all about. So the cross is the center of history. It's the center of heaven. And the question for us this morning is it the center of your life? Is it something that you think, wow, that's amazing, that's for me. Jesus did that for me. How do we do that? Well, let's keep reading about it. Let's keep singing about it. Let's keep telling each other about it. And pray as we kind of build up to Easter this year, the cross and the resurrection would hit us afresh in all his wonder and glory. But you see the twist in the story. The twist here is the big encouragement, how the lion and the one who holds the destiny of the world is the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing Lamb. But remember, it's a lamb that is slain. Now you think, I want a lion. A lion I can understand. A lion I can get behind. One rallying the troops. But a limping lamb looks so frail and weak. How did Jesus win? He won by losing. He won by giving up his life. And God is saying, I'm going to fix this world through a weak, dying lamb. Now, the reality that's been shown us in the glimpse of heaven is this. God doesn't work in the way we think. He will use weak and unexpected ways to accomplish his purposes. He doesn't work through powerful, flashy, influential things like that. No, he works through the weak and the powerless and the nobodies. Do you remember the story that Corrie ten Boom shared in her book, Tramp for the Lord? It's after Corrie ten Boom after the war, she went around telling people about how God kept her and helped her in a concentration camp throughout that war. And on her travels, she ended up visiting Russia during the communist time there during the Cold War. And she went on to say this, when I was there, I met this old woman who was lying on a small sofa propped up by pillows. Her body was bent and twisted and almost beyond recognition by the dreaded disease, multiple sclerosis. Her old husband spent all his time caring for her since she was unable to move off the sofa. The only part of her body she could control was her right hand. And with the index finger of that hand, she had for many years glorified God by typing on a typewriter beside her. All day and far into the night she would type. What did she type? She translated Christian books into Russian. And she always used one finger, peck, peck, peck. She typed out the pages, portions of the Bible, books by Billy Graham and Corrie ten Boom. Not only did she translate the books, her husband said, but she prays for these people every day while she types. Sometimes it takes a long time for her finger to hit the key, or for her to get the paper in the machine, but all the time she's praying for those whose books she's working on. And then Corrie ten Boom said this, I looked at her wasted form on the sofa, her head pulled down and her feet curled under her body. I said, oh Lord, why don't you heal her? Her husband, sensing my anguish of soul, gave the answer. God has a purpose in her sickness. Every other Christian in the city is watched by the secret police, but because she's been sick for so long, no one ever looks in on her. They leave us alone, and she's the only person in all the city who can type quietly. See, it's not through the impressive or the powerful that God was encouraging Christians there in Russia, but it's through somebody who could only use one hand. But God used weakness, and he used her frailty for his glory. He doesn't work in the ways we expect. He uses the lamb that was slain. So if you feel this morning, who am I? Well, God can use you in your weakness. Think of the first century Christians who would have been reading this. They're going through this persecution, feeling weak and forgotten, and then they realize, no, this is the path of Jesus. He died. And I'm following the risen Savior. So as they're going through this, as they're looking here, there's encouragement in this lamb that was slain. Notice as well as we come to close, in verse 8, around this throne we see something else. There's this lamb that was slain, but as well, there's this golden bowl full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. So Jesus takes the scroll in his hand, and right in the mix of all of this, that is the destination of the universe, the history there in his hand. In the middle of it all is this incense. And we're told that's the prayers of Christians. And what's that saying? What's the picture it's getting across? Around the throne of heaven, the power source of the universe, the real throne above all thrones, right there, that's where the prayers of believers are and where they're heard. all their tears, all their groans, all of their pleas are around the throne of heaven. Now again, put yourself in the first century, in the sandals of a first century Christian. They might have felt forgotten about, ignored, a nobody in the light of this power of Rome. And then they're told, remember your prayers. They're right around the throne of heaven, and they're in a precious bowl of gold. That's how precious your prayers are to God. Now, as you think of your prayers coming up this week, maybe looking back at last week, perhaps sometimes you've got 10 seconds to pray, and you say, Lord, I need your help. And you're in a desperate state. That prayer is around the throne of heaven. Perhaps you feel like they're feeble, frail groans. That might be the case, but God hears, and they're there. You might think, does anybody here? Well, here, look where your prayers are, in that golden, precious bowl rising to the throne of heaven. So make the most of prayer this week. Plead with him. That's where the power is. That's where the power is, in prayer. It seems like weakness, but that's what God wants to use. When we grasp this, when we see these pictures, do you see what the response is of these people? We hear as they see this one who is worthy of praise. They sang a new song, verse 9, worthy are you to take the scroll. And they start to sing, verse 12, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might. We're told there's just this cascade of praise, that myriads and myriads of people, do you see that in verse 11? There were living creatures, many angels, and they were all saying this in a loud voice. We're told that they grabbed a harp, and that harp was being played. That's kind of an upbeat instrument back in the day. It would have been like a folk instrument, so like a banjo, something like that, just a foot-tapping joy. Here it is, Jesus is worthy to open the seal. And so as we sing praise to Jesus, do you see what we're doing? We're having a foretaste of heaven, rejoicing in the Lamb who was slain, rejoicing in these truths. And so we come and worship him. He is the worthy lion. He is the Lamb who was slain. He's the one we want to keep our eyes on. So in the midst of uncertainty, where do we turn? There is a throne, and it's occupied. Let that speak peace to your heart this morning. There is a plan. Jesus can open the scroll. He is accomplishing his plan. It will involve tough times, but he is bringing his way to pass. And there is a Saviour, the lion and the lamb that was slain. So let's pray this week that we put Revelation 4 and 5 filters as we watch the news, as we observe what's happening in our lives around us. But let me just finish by talking to you, if you're not yet a Christian, maybe you feel all lost because things just seem chaotic. Can you see, just for a moment, what it would be like to know there's somebody on the throne of heaven who loves you and who knows you, and he says, will you trust me? He invites you again this morning to come to him, to come to the Lamb who was slain for you, so that you could be forgiven and have access to this throne day and night. He is bigger than any storm we face, bigger than any situation that might confuse us. You can turn to him today and know the peace he brings.